Hello friends, welcome to the MARE Podcast. Before we get started, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Don't forget that you can find more about the MARE project at www.marehamburg.com, and you can support the project and this podcast through Patreon. All the links are in the description. Enjoy!
Hello friends, welcome to another episode of the MARE Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Jaris in the podcast. Hello, Jaris. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. So, to get things started, Jaris, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience? Say who you are, what you're doing, where are you right now? Give us details.
Absolutely. My name's Jaris. I'm Canadian. I'm, I think, the third Canadian you've had on this podcast, which is cool. That line going, there's maybe more. I don't know.
No, you're like third. You're third.
Third?
Yeah, third.
Yes. Okay, I got that down. Starting strong. And I'm currently here in Cyprus. I'm in Nicosia, and my work, as we'll talk about, is on Cyprus, hence my location. I grew up in Canada. I did my undergraduate degree in Canada as well, mostly in my hometown. And I had like a roundabout way of getting into archaeology. My background was in political studies and history, actually. And then I kind of did some classical studies work at the end of my BA, and from there sort of found my way into archaeology. And then I studied at the University of Cyprus for the past 2 years for my master's degree in field archaeology. I just finished in June, which is great. I picked up my diploma yesterday because I was in Iraq while I was having my grad party. And yeah, that's a very brief summary of me, and we'll talk lots more, sure.
Nice. So one thing, mental note for later, I want to talk about Iraq and how was that. But later, first, before we go into that, one of the main reasons I thought about inviting you to this podcast is because in June, when I was in Maniki with Juan, previous episode, and Professor Stella Domestica, she mentions like, oh, you must read Jaris's thesis. It's amazing. And I was like, who? Huh. So then I got in touch. I was like, hey, do you want to come to the podcast and talk about the thesis? And then I asked you to like send me the thesis to read it, and I read it, and it's very good. So I want to talk about that. Do you want to give us a brief summary, abstract of what the thesis is about?
Absolutely. And thank you, Professor Domestica, for the high praise. Also, that's amazing. Yes, so my thesis is on the site of Kition, which also Juan talked about in a different kind of element and aspect in his episode. And I'm looking specifically at one area of Kition. Kition's kind of complicated because it's under modern-day Larnaca, one of the cities here in Cyprus. And so excavation were kind of divided into different elements. There's the necropolis, and then there's a sacred area, which I focus on. It's called Kition-Kathari, or Kition Area 2. And then there's also the well-known Kition-Bambula. It's primarily classical archaeology that remains there. We have some really interesting ship sheds. And there's obviously some late Bronze Age evidence there too. Kition itself as a city was founded in 1300 BC, so the late Bronze Age here in Cyprus. It was an important port trade center in Cyprus. And in this sacred area, there were a number of large monumental buildings constructed at the beginning of the foundation of the city in 1300, and then especially there was some reconstruction effort around 1190, so the 12th century. And these monumental buildings have been called temples by the excavators and when they were published, and they have religious and ritual connotations to them. I mean, even the term temple as like a precursor to more about my work has some sort of classical Greek connotations. I feel like when we talk about a temple, people are going to think of the Parthenon. This isn't what we're looking at. We don't have this sort of classical monumental facade, but we do have big buildings that were used for some elements of ritual and rituality. So I kind of wanted to focus in on that because, as everyone will tell you, my forte and interest is ritual and religion in Cyprus and the ancient world. And so anywhere I can look at that carefully, obviously, but I want to look at it. And I want to look at it from a maritime viewpoint, which is kind of, I think, a little bit unique and interesting because it's not something that's been done a lot in Cyprus itself, is looking at how ritual and the maritime sphere come together. There's a lot of scholarly work that's been done elsewhere in the Mediterranean on this topic, but specifically in Cyprus, we're kind of lacking in that field. And if we have talked about it, it's rather sort of ephemeral, it's very brief, and you don't go into a lot of details. So when you're approaching a topic like ritual, it's always really important to kind of define your terms and also define what you're looking at, because ritual or these repeated actions, often related to some sort of like religious thing in antiquity, but they might not be related to religion. They might just be a repeated action that humans do to make themselves feel better. And how do we actually see that is an important like question when you're looking at the archaeological material. And so how was I going to approach this with my master's? Well, I wanted to look something maritime. And so Kition is well known for having a whole heck of a ton of anchors used throughout this sacred area. There were 147 published anchors, and we'll talk more about that. But that's what I honed in on. That's what I focused on. I looked at the anchors used in this religious complex and how they connected to a maritime type of ritual. And then I really wanted to kind of delve in and go further than other work has been done up to this point.
Excellent. So before we get into like the details of it, because there's people listening to this podcast who are not archaeologists, and they sometimes have no idea what we're talking about. Can you explain to us how does a Bronze Age anchor look like? When we talk about anchors in this stage, what are we talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like even people who are archaeologists, but they're not maritime archaeologists, and even maritime archaeologists who don't work in the Mediterranean sphere, don't really know what a Bronze Age or an Iron Age anchor looks like. It's a great question, because I think when we see an anchor, you might see that kind of like tattoo design of like a modern anchor with like rope or a mermaid or whatever. And that's not what anchors looked like in the ancient world until kind of the late Iron Age and then the classical period going forward. Before that, anchors were made of stone. So I'm looking at specifically stone anchors. And they're basically big, kind of flat square blocks or flat triangular blocks. So primarily in the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, your anchors are trapezoidal or a little bit rectangular or triangular. And they kind of fall into two different categories. We have an anchor called a weight anchor, which basically has one pierced hole at the top of that stone, and you're going to tie a rope through it, which you would attach to the ship. So you can have your anchor to do what it's supposed to do, stop a ship when it can't go any further or when you're in a storm. Or, as they work today, they still work the same way. And then we have a second type of anchor, which is a composite anchor. And so this has your top pierced hole, and then there's two like arm holes basically at the bottom of this anchor, and you're going to put a fluke or a stake of wood through those two holes, and that'll allow it to catch on like a sandy seafloor and help the anchor even better to stop the ship, among other reasons. There's kind of more details about composite anchors and weight anchors, but that's like a basic overview of what an anchor looks like. And then we do see some shifts in their shape in the middle of the Iron Age. We have more classical images of anchors.
Yeah, excellent. So now we have an idea of how an anchor looks like. And as you said before, and if I remember correctly, in Gideon, there have been 147 or 174?
Although
147.
147, although I cut that number down in my work. But yes, the original publication is 147.
147 anchors found in this big complex that is, they call it the temple complex, the Kathari area 2, whatever it's called. So where do we find these anchors in this complex? What are the areas that we find them?
Wonderful question. Okay, so Area 2 is kind of divided into a number of different structures. When it was first built in 1300, when the city was founded, we had two kind of small, what we're going to call temples. I'm going to use the terminology temple for these monumental structures. Again, don't think classical temple. They're sort of made of these big, beautiful stone, work stones oftentimes, or smaller stones, kind of creating these sometimes open, not roof structures, and sometimes roof structures, is what we assume. So at the foundation of Kition, there were two temples. They were called Temple 3 and Temple 2. And Temple 3 ended up sort of being covered over when we had this big monumental reconstruction phase about 100 years after the foundation of the city. And then we had some bigger structures built, and those are the ones that I really focus on in my work and that you can still see today when you come and visit Kition in Larnaca. It's a great archaeological site. So we have a big, big temple called Temple 1, and this is associated especially with the Phoenicians in Kition in the Iron Age and later periods. And we can come back to that because even the Phoenicians in Kition, it's a complex, complicated topic, as I know you've discussed and everyone's discussed. And I don't really talk about that anyway. It's not super important to what I'm discussing in my research, but it's still something to keep in mind. But it's this big, monumental, the biggest temple in this complex. And then we have some smaller, but still large buildings, Temple 2, Temple 4, Temple 5. And then there's also associated workshops in this religious area. There's the northern workshops, which are associated with copper and metallurgical working, which is where we find a lot of anchors, as well as in Temple 4, Temple 5, Temple 2. We find some in Temple 1, but they're sort of in awkward context. Their placement's not super certain. And so I don't focus a lot on that. Part of that is because when Temple 1 became used during the Iron Age, we lose all the context from earlier floors. They were all sort of raised by the modification efforts that kind of took place in the 8th century, and so we don't have a great context for anchors in this structure. But there were anchors, and obviously the lack of evidence doesn't mean there weren't anchors used there, but I don't talk about that a ton. And then finally, kind of in between these temples, I know this is hard to picture, guys. If you can find maps of the floor plans or a link to my work or whatever, do that because it's easier to situate yourself. But in between all of these temples, there were 2 open air spaces, or temenoi, which is like a sacred open air area, temenos A and temenos B. And in those temenoi, we do find anchors as well.
Very nice. So we have an area. We have the temples, we have the temenoi, we have anchors everywhere all around. So before we get into more detail, I remember that you talk about 3 different sizes of anchors. Because if we talk about stone anchors, big anchors, you have to think that some were pretty big and pretty heavy. So it took a lot of time to actually put it up there, like set it up. So what kind of sizes are we talking about here?
Okay, so most of the anchors kind of fall between, say, like 100 kilograms and like 400 kilograms, which are smaller of all the anchors. Like, that's the majority of anchors. That's huge. I mean, if we're actually thinking about that, like 400 kilograms already is like too heavy for maybe 2 buff guys or 2 buff women could lift that. But it's very, very heavy. So we have kind of anchors clustering specifically around those sizes. And then we have some really, really, really big outliers. The largest anchor found at Kition is 1 ton, or about 1,000 kilograms in size. Now, what's interesting is when these anchors were published, obviously it's kind of hard to weigh things of this size. A lot of them are, well, not a lot, some of them are still in situ at the site, and so they weren't lifted, they couldn't be moved or measured. And so there were a couple estimates given in the early publications. And then in my work, I kind of went through and I recalculated for every single anchor that I was working with their sizes to get these weight estimates. So it's sort of based off like density estimates, size estimates based on published drawings of all these anchors. So we have the largest, it was published at about 1 ton, and I remeasured it at about like 950 kilograms. Pretty much the same thing, but really, really, really big. And then we do have some very small ones, like 40 kilograms, so quite small comparatively. Predominantly, they sort of cluster between maybe like 100 and 300 kilograms.
Yeah, so there's an interesting methodology there that I want you to talk a bit about, because someone listening might be interested in it. That you, if I understand correctly, you haven't actually seen the anchors, but you calculated their weight through the drawings and the measurements, correct?
Yes, exactly. So when I first... Yeah, honestly, how did I do that? It took me a bit to figure that out. So when I first wanted to do this research, I wanted to actually go and physically work with as many of the anchors as I could find to kind of act as the basis for this research and this work. And that didn't end up happening for a number of reasons. I mean, trying to get permission to work with them in the storerooms, that's a whole thing. And, time limitations for an MA thesis, that wasn't easily feasible at the time. And also, and this is something I think I'll talk about more as we go on, but people don't care a lot about anchors like they didn't when they first were excavated in other sites. And they do, at least they were published very well from this site. But then after the fact, the sort of post-excavation storage, they're kind of all over the place. And I think a lot of them, we don't even know where they are now, which sucks. And that's sort of a long-term goal, is to go and try and locate all of these anchors and do the actual work with them as a supplement and continuation of this work. But in lieu of that, yes, what I did is basically, when the anchors were published in 1985 by Anna Frost, she was pioneering on anchors, and she has a beautiful catalog for them, which I worked from and then added to and changed some things. She published drawings of almost every anchor that she talks about. And so from those anchors, I had to digitize all of them because, unfortunately, none of these publications are online. I mean, we have a great sort of database today of work that's been digitized that we can use and find online, but this was not one of them. And so I had to digitize all of the catalog pages from these publications, the Kition Volume 5 excavations. And from that, I wanted to remeasure basically based on the scales that they included in all the drawings. So, I mean, the point of doing a drawing in archaeology, one of the points is you have a scale there and you're able to sort of manually like use a ruler and like measure and then actually calculate what the general size would have been. And I could have done that because I had the pages. But what is a little bit better and it has a less sort of margin of error is to use like a digital scale. So basically I digitized everything and then working in Inkscape, a software, I set a digital scale that corresponded to the scale we have in these drawings themselves. And then I used that to take measurements of the width and the height of the anchor, or the top and bottom width and the height of the anchor and thickness. And then from that, calculated surface area, calculated volume, and then used general volumetric estimates of stone. So most stone runs between 1,800 and 2,200 kilograms per cubic meter. And there was another group of awesome archaeologists who were working with anchors from Cyprus, actually, who they didn't use Inkscape, but they did a similar thing for size estimate. And they took the standard weight of 2,000 kilograms per cubic meter. So I just took that as well, because the stone used for these anchors is predominantly sandstone or limestone, but it does vary. And so for the sake of this work, 2,000 was sort of like a good middle ground. And so I did that, used that to calculate the mass for every anchor, and then kind of organize that statistically.
Okay, great. So when trying to, give me a minute before we go into that. I think we need to comment on. You talked about the stone from which the anchors were made, and I think we should note that most of them were Cypriot anchors, correct?
Cypriot anchors in what sense of the
word? They were made from Cypriot stone. No.
Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely. So all of them were basically made from local sandstone or limestone, with the exception of 4. Okay, that's actually like with the exception of like 2. All of them were from actually local like areas. All of them. Let me rephrase that. When we're looking at stone, we can pretty much assume it's coming from a certain location. So almost all the anchors were made from stone that likely came from a local area in the Kition, in the Larnaca district. It could have come from somewhere else. Most likely it came locally. A couple were made from stone from Akamos in Cyprus as well, but they would have had to have been transported. And then we have one example of stone that matches like petrographic analysis from Egypt or from the Near East. But yes, predominantly they're made from local Cypriot stone. And they also have local kind of Cypriot associated styles, shapes.
Mm-hmm. So what does that tell you about when it comes to rituals? Like, is it something a Cypriot thing? Because it's not, right?
No, it's not. And that's actually that's a great segue. So Kition is the site with the most amount of anchors found on land in a terrestrial context. But we have 2 other important sites in the Eastern Mediterranean that also have large collections of anchors. We have one at Ugarit, which is in modern-day Syria, and one site at Byblos, which is in modern-day Lebanon. Now, those sites have clusters of anchors, and they're also similarly in a ritual setting, so they're found in a temple or a religious complex. But they are in smaller quantities. The ones at Byblos, we have 28 that come total from Byblos, not all in the temple, but a lot are from the temples. And then we have 43, again, that are published coming from Ugarit. And most of those are in a temple, but some come from the harbor and houses and tombs. So it's not a specifically Cypriot thing, but having a specific Cypriot stone for these anchors does tell us most likely they were made locally, and they were, at least what I argue based on all of the work that I did, they were made specifically for use within the temples at Kition. So they weren't just random reused material from elsewhere or from locally that was just kind of built into these temples. There was intention behind their utility.
Yeah. Excellent. So I will get to utility in a minute when talking about something else, but just like as a sub intro to this topic, I don't know. It's like when we talk about rituals, as far as I understood, we talk about discovering patterns, right? Patterns in our material, and enough patterns that say this is not random, this is intentional. And within your thesis, you were trying to find patterns, and you do find a lot of patterns in many different ways. So talking about patterns, I want to first talk about the markings and the burn marks on the anchors, because there were marks on them, and you found some associations based on where they were found and how they looked. And can you talk to us a bit more about that? I'm very interested to listening about that.
Absolutely. So the markings and the burnings are some of the most interesting sort of markers of rituality that we find on the anchors. And they're one of the things that sort of drew me to this topic in general. Obviously, a large mass of anchors at a religious site already speaks volumes, but then having potential repeated patterns in the type of things we find on those anchors themselves really interested me, and I wanted to look into that. And obviously, there could have been nothing, but there were some really interesting patterns. So I mean, when you find a mark on something, it might have to do with their actual utility. You have maker's marks on things. On pottery, you have like potter's marks, and that's not always ritual. Even in the case of anchors, you find marked anchors in other contexts. You find them under the sea, so they were a used anchor that had a mark. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's ritual. And I think I want to be very clear about that. When I'm saying ritual, I did kind of carefully consider everything, because I think, and I'm not guilty of this because I make fun of it at this point, but all archaeologists, if we don't know what's happening, we call it ritual. Like that's the sort of the old Adam. And it's important to be deliberate and consistent when you're looking at something like ritual. And obviously, everything I'm saying, there could be another explanation, but we have a lot of clear patterns that point to a specific type of rituality. Okay, cool. Pendulum aside. So the anchors themselves, the ones that I ended up working with. So I said I had, sorry, this is just a precursor to cut down, so we have like quantities. And there were 147 published. I cut that down to 99 anchors that I worked with. I got rid of anything that didn't really look like an anchor. It probably wasn't. And Honor Frost and other people said maybe not an anchor. And I took out anything that was really, really fragmented, because that's not useful for the type of work I wanted to look at. And that left me with 99 anchors that I focused on. Okay. About 20% of those anchors, so 20 anchors total, had either burning on them, markings, or another type of ritual element called a cupule, which is basically like a kind of indent, almost like a cup hole inside that's carved in the stone. And they're found on anchors and other types of stone throughout the Mediterranean and actually throughout the world, and they're often associated with ritual. They might be used for the placement of ritual objects, items, offerings, what have you. And so a total of 20 anchors had one or more of these type of markings on them. Now, specifically, anchors with marks, only 6 of them had marks, but they were in very specific locations, and they were often paired with burning. So we find most of our marked anchors are actually placed within walls, which, when you find an anchor, it's stone, it's useful, it's good building material in a wall, you can't automatically say it's ritual. And I didn't want to automatically say ritual. Okay, it could just be building material. There's other reasons to argue against it just being building material, and we can come back to that. But the ones that were placed in walls with marks were also found all within this one specific temple, Temple 4. And Temple 4 is really interesting because it's actually was located very close to the ancient coastline. And I should mention, Kition today is not located near the sea at all. It's about 500 meters away from the modern coastline. But in antiquity, it actually lay on the sea. The sea was basically right there. There was the city wall and then the water. And so this temple was located right next to the water. And it has the most amount of anchors, actually. We find the largest quantity of anchors in any temple is in Temple 4. And a couple of them have these marks on them. And also some of those marked anchors, so 6 of them are marked in this temple, and 2 of those marked anchors are also burnt. So there's sort of a combination of factors. But beyond that, the marked and burned anchors are placed together. They're in alignment, in the same sort of alignment in the wall. They're in the same level. And we find 4 groupings of aligned anchors within this wall. So already we see a kind of pattern emerging in the types of things we find on these anchors in a specific context. And so that was really interesting to me. We have something that has a maritime association that's also been marked and sometimes burned, placed in walls in large quantities in one specific temple. And what I think this may represent is an example of a building deposit. So in Near Eastern archaeology and in Mediterranean archaeology, we talk about building deposits or foundation deposits. A building deposit is a little bit more general. It's basically indicative of some sort of ritual happening at the foundation or construction of a building. So we do this today. Even when you finish the construction of a building, you might have a celebration, you might have a mayor cutting a string or a ribbon. And that's sort of like a modern example of a building or a foundation deposit. So sort of celebration at the start or at the end of construction. And so we have something similar going on often with important structures, monumental ones. They might not necessarily be temples. In this case, they are. And so seeing burning markings and or these cupules, which could have been used for offerings at the time of construction, seem to indicate we have a specific pattern or phenomenon going on here, sort of ritual that was done at the start or the construction of this temple. And also I should mention all of these burned, marked anchors come from the 12th century horizon when this temple was actually first constructed. We have other anchors in this temple coming a little bit later, but predominantly they're coming from the 12th century. And we also have 3 bronze objects that were found, also dating to the 12th century, within Temple 4 that were published as a foundation deposit. So foundation is specifically underneath the building. Building deposit can be anywhere in the building. It can be underneath, it can be in a wall. That's the sort of differentiation in those terms. And so we have sort of continuation of this pattern, but having the anchor specifically seems to put a maritime and sort of thought into the foundation of this building itself. It's not just let's have a ritual and celebrate a foundation. Let's bring forth a maritime idea and have that associated with this structure from its sort of inception.
Oh yeah. And you know what, like, here are my 2 cents, but sometimes when I was reading, I was thinking about, you know how some cathedrals or some churches like Northern Europe, there's all these maritime window glasses things that you walk into a church and you see, you know, a ship and a trident, especially in Belgium or in like northern countries where like port cities, right? Yes. And I was like, in my mind, it was kind of a similar experience when you walk into this area, this temple, this temples, whatever, and you see these things, these maritime decorations that were very visible and people could see it. And it definitely meant something, right? Because if it didn't, it wouldn't be as intentional. So what are your, let's say, because I don't want to go into like extreme detail here, but like, what are your, like, after you were done with this thesis, what convinced you that yes, there is ritual? Like, what are your conclusions on this? That yes, there's ritual, and this is what made me absolutely 100% sure that there's ritual here. And it's not just people needed building material and the anchors were like big stones, so useful building material.
I think, yeah, that's a great question because, again, that's probably what everyone's asking. Why weren't they just useful building material? I think the intentionality in the placement of these anchors in the walls is one example, but we find them in a lot of other sort of placement positions that have a clear connection to a rituality or a visibility. And so if something's visible in the mind of the beholder, you're going to have some sort of connections. Like you just said, when you go into a cathedral and you have this beautiful ship iconography, that's going to make something click in your brain. And so a lot of the anchors that I focus on as being potentially ritual and then convincing me of the actual ritual activity occurring here are in a very visible position. So we find a lot of anchors actually placed in thresholds. So it's like the step basically into these buildings, specifically in Temple 2, we have broken anchors in a visible threshold placement. And then we also have anchors that are associated with altars or offering tables, which are a tool of ritual. This is where you would place your offerings. And so we have a maritime anchor connected to this item or object of ritual, which kind of strengthens that tie. And we also, this was, I think, one of the things that really stood out to me and I focused on quite a bit. We have anchors that are placed either upright or just freely within some of these buildings. And so if you were just using an anchor as random reused building material, you might just find them in the walls. And for example, at another late Bronze Age site in Cyprus, very close to Kition, in the Larnaca district, Alasuthan-Zeke, we find lots of anchors reused in houses and other types of large buildings. About 41 have been published, and there's more actually. There's some found in tombs. I've worked with some of them. But they all show, for example, useware. They were all probably used out at sea. They might have broken, and then they were reused because, again, you don't want to waste stone material. It's good building material. Let's incorporate this into a wall. Whereas at Kition, we don't really see any examples of useware. We don't have rope wear at the rope holes of these anchors, so they probably weren't used at sea. We still can see some chisel marks on these anchors, which means they weren't sort of dunked in water constantly, which would cause that to erode rather quickly, especially with limestone or sandstone. So we don't see any type of use wear, and we see them in these very specific installations. So we see them visibly in thresholds, we see them upright, standing with no connection to architecture. And those ones also often have burning. They've been found associated with like Ukrainia, so bull skulls. And that also kind of connects to rituality. I can talk more about that if we have time. And also we find a couple of them in place as an actual like tool for a libation. So a libation is an offering you would give of food, water, wine, something sort of intangible, and you might offer this in thanks for something. In a maritime context, it could be in gratitude for surviving a sea journey or in anticipation of going to sea. In a society where your livelihood is dependent on the sea and on water, which is the case for this major port trading commercial center of Kition, you would want to do everything in your power to ensure that you were successful. And so giving an offering before and after a voyage is like common sense. And so we actually find two, potentially three really large, like 600 kilogram anchors stacked on top of one another with their rope holes aligned. And so you could have poured something through those rope holes. This is a big installation, could be used for rituals, and it's very visible. And so finding anchors in all of these deliberate positions with specific rituality in terms of their marking or their utility really sort of, I think, drove home the point that we do have a maritime specific element of ritual at Kition, not just ritual in general, which other objects and artifacts point to.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, for me, it's like when something is found in a temple, in a kind of like, I want to say like public setting, in a temple, like something that has to do with religion, it cannot be by accident. Like it wasn't there by accident. It wasn't there because they didn't have any other stones. They're like, maybe we use the anchors. So I don't know. That's my personal like thought about it. So can we get a bit philosophical here? You're down for some philosophy? All right. So I'm going to read you something. It may sound familiar to you, but I'm going to read it to you. The sea has always been both a place of anxiety and danger, as well as opportunity. The use of this natural environment created groups of people, from seafarers and fishermen to boat builders and merchants. Because of the widespread association of cultural activities with the water, ancient religions generally included rituals connected to the sea. You may recognize this because these are the first 4 lines of your thesis. And my question is, why? Why rituals connected to the sea? Why do we feel this need to, and everywhere in the world, it's not like a separate phenomenon, everywhere in the world, why do we ritualize the sea so much, according to you?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think there's a lot of explanations and answers, and I'll try and, summarize them. But I think for one thing, it's in human nature to try and control everything we possibly can. But I think the sea is one thing. I think we kind of, maybe in the modern era, we still try and control it. But I think for the most part, throughout history, humanity has understood that the sea is sort of this liminal space of danger. You could have a storm that could wipe you out in a second, but it's also a place of productivity. This is where we get our food. This is how we trade and we interact with other people. And so I think it's this really important body in the world. Is the sea, is water. It can be a lake as well in different cultures in like North and South America. And this is how we are connected to one another and also how we're separated. And so I think ritual is a way to try and control this or have a modicum of control over this really important element to human sort of livelihood and production and, change. Yeah, I think, that's really interesting. Like you see it, and you see it everywhere. We see this in like Viking culture. One of the reasons that I even got into this type of focus of maritime rituality is we see it in like Greek culture, where we have like Poseidon, who's this big storm god, but people didn't worship him to survive at sea. They worshipped other deities like the Dioscuri, or specifically what I'm interested in is Aphrodite. She was a goddess everyone associates with love and beauty, but she was more than that. She was about sort of mixing things up and calming things. And so people would pray to her to calm the seas so that they could have safe passage. And I mean, I think that even speaks to humanity and why we ritualize things is we have a deity who's associated not necessarily with the sea, but she's still connected to it through her birth and through function. And we see this in Near Eastern cultures as well. I mean, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, we have major deities always in all of these cultures who use the water uh, as a means to hopefully preserve your enterprise and your life. I mean, we see it in the Bible even. We see it in multiple passages in the Bible. Ezekiel, they talk about the importance of the sea, the danger of the sea. Yeah, I think it's about control, it's about understanding, and it's about seeing something and I don't know, making the best of it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. That's a beautiful answer. Thank you so much. So something that mental note, going back to my mental note, can you talk to us a bit about Iraq? How was that? How was working in Iraq?
Absolutely. It was really good, and it had like really good parts, really bad parts. So like I mean, I focused on Cypriot archaeology. I predominantly worked in Cyprus, and I wanted to branch out a little bit and do some excavation work further east. And one of my other interests in archaeology, and it was sort of like a coin flip when I was deciding on my focus, either Cyprus or Mesopotamia. So I was like, okay, cool. I'd love to actually try and work in Iraq, but it always felt like this, I think, untouchable place, this sort of place of danger we have in the media, this idea about a very unstable country that's always like dealing with unrest. And so that's one of the reasons I chose Cyprus. Among other things, I wanted to work on the sea. We don't have the sea in Mesopotamia. We have water, we have amazing rivers, but we don't have the sea. But I think this year I was like, you know what? No, I'm going to look and see if I can find a project that's in Iraq to work somewhere else, do something a little bit different, and something else that I'm really kind of also in love with. And so I found a project in Iraq, Kurdistan, which is located in the northern part of Iraq. And it's a bit of a bubble. It literally has a buffer zone, and it has a specific visa. It has technically its own government, different than Iraq. And it's a little bit more stable than Iraq proper. Although even the idea of Iraq being this really dangerous place is sort of a very, I think, Western idea. It's been promoted by basically media for time immemorial. I know growing up, my generation, we see Iraq and all of the Middle East as a scary place, which it's not. Obviously, there's a lot of unrest going on. We don't need to talk about that much about world politics right now. But when I was there, we had the war, the like 12-day war between Iran and Israel. And we had missiles flying over where I was staying in Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan, which was a bit of a surreal experience. Like there were a couple of missiles shot down by the early warning and protection system of Kurdistan. But overall, I loved being there. The archaeology was fantastic. It was a Middle Bronze Age settlement on a tell. I was supervising like a neighborhood quarter with multiple like northern Mesopotamian houses and a really interesting drainage system. So I had a bit of water there. That was really cool. And the people on that team were amazing. And Kurdistan in general is a fantastic sort of semi-autonomous nation. Like the people are really wonderful. Obviously you have everyone everywhere, but they were awesome. The topography and the nature is phenomenal as well. If you think of Iraq, you might think of really dry, and you have that in Kurdistan, but you also have incredible mountains. You have the Zagros mountain range. You have one of the, like an example of a Neanderthal cave, which was phenomenal. Shanidar Cave is this like world-renowned cave we got to go see, which is cool. So yeah, it was a very interesting project with a lot of, I think, interesting learning and yeah.
Excellent. Wow. So let me thank you for being here and sharing all this with us. And let me start by saying that you will be featured in one of the upcoming MARE lectures, aren't you? So
yes,
if people are, the program is not out yet, so I'm not going to spoil anything. But if people want more of you, stay tuned with the updates of the MARE committee regarding the monthly lectures, and you will be talking a whole lot more in a more academic setting about anchors and Kition. So thank you very much for being here. That was a very enjoyable session of listening about anchors. I think the topic is super interesting, and ritual, even though I don't work with anything that has to do with ritual, I find it amazing. And do you have any closing remarks for the people listening?
I mean, thank you all for tuning in. If you want to see like more imagery and pictures of actually what I'm talking about, because I feel like that is such a huge thing in archaeology in general, trying to visualize anything when you're at a site or when you're listening to something like this. It might be difficult. So if you want to know what those composite anchors look like or where they're placed, or when I'm talking about an altar or an upright anchor or like pole skulls, I'll have images. I'll have a lot more in that in the lecture. So please tune into that. That'll be amazing. And yeah, I mean, I hope this inspires people to focus on ritual in a specific sense and, I don't know, bring the maritime wherever you can in archaeology and elsewhere. So
Beautiful. That was beautiful. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and see you all next one. Bye.